The Tower of London is more than a fortress. It is a 1,000-year-old container for England's most famous tragedies. While most ghost stories fade with time, the hauntings here, from the headless spectre of Anne Boleyn to the two princes who vanished into the stone itself, only seem to grow stronger. We aren't just looking at legends, we are looking at a building that refuses to let the dead rest. But among the royal executions and the vanished children, one question remains. Is the tower repeating these tragedies as a memory, or is something within these walls actually calling them back? In this video, we return for Volume 2 of The Famous Dead of the Tower of London. She is the ghost many people expect to find at the Tower of London, but few realise that Anne Boleyn's legend was built on very real, terrifying reports from the men hired to guard her grave. Long before the tourists arrived, the yeoman warders were already documenting sightings of a pale queen moving through the darkness near Tower Green. Sometimes she is seen close to the chapel where her body was hidden for centuries. Other times, she appears as a headless figure moving toward the site of her execution. But who were the men who saw her, and why did her story persist even after her remains were finally identified? To understand the ghost, we have to look at the woman who was brought back to the tower in May 1536. Only 3 years earlier, Anne had entered these same gates in a magnificent coronation procession. Now, the gates closed behind her for the last time. She was held in the Queen's house, a place that still stands today. It was here that her fear turned to a strange, hollowed-out acceptance. The reports of her haunting don't just wander anywhere. They follow the exact route of her final fall. From the Queen's house to the scaffold on Tower Green, and finally to the cold stone floor of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. One of the most famous documented accounts doesn't come from a storyteller, but from a military court-martial in 1864. A sentry was found fainted on duty near the Queen's house. When he was charged with neglect of duty, his defence was chilling. He claimed a white figure had emerged from the morning mist, moving directly toward him. When he challenged the figure, and it didn't stop, he lunged with his bayonet, only for the weapon to pass straight through the form. This wasn't just one man's imagination. 2 other witnesses, including a captain, claimed to have seen the figure from a window above. The sentry was eventually acquitted. It is reports like these, official, documented, and life-altering, that keep Anne's memory alive within these walls. For centuries, it was rumoured that Anne's body was thrown into a common chest and buried in haste. In 1876, during renovations of the Chapel Royal, Queen Victoria gave permission to exhume the area under the chancel. There they found exactly what the legends described: the remains of a woman in her late 20s, buried with a lack of dignity that didn't match her status. When she was reburied with more ceremony, many thought the sightings would stop. They didn't. If anything, the quieter versions of the story became more frequent. The sound of a woman weeping in the corridors of the Queen's house, or a shape passing through a locked door where the old stairs used to be. Whether Anne's spirit truly walks is something no one can prove, but her presence at the tower is undeniable. It is there in the silence around Tower Green, and in the uneasy feeling that her death was never fully settled by the swing of a sword. History kept bringing her back, but the tower seems to have never let her go. When visitors step inside the Bloody Tower, they know they are close to one of the darkest mysteries in English history. Even before the story is told, the place seems to prepare them for something terrible. The haunting most often connected with it is 2 small figures, sometimes described as boys in pale nightclothes, seen for a moment in the shadows before they vanish into the stone walls. The story belongs to Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. In 1483, after the death of their father, the boys were brought here while arrangements were supposedly being made for Edward's coronation. Edward was 12, Richard was only 9. Their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, declared them illegitimate and took the throne as Richard III. After that, the boys were seen less and less through the bars of their windows. Then, they disappeared entirely, No public funeral followed, no official explanation was given. For nearly 200 years, their fate was a matter of rumour, until 1674. Workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower found a wooden chest buried 10 feet deep. Inside were the bones of 2 children. While many thought this discovery closed the case, the mystery only deepened. In 1933, the bones were exhumed for scientific examination. The results were haunting. The ages matched the princes perfectly. And some experts believed a staining on the skulls suggested death by suffocation. Yet, without modern DNA testing, a sliver of doubt remains. And it is in that doubt that the ghosts thrive. Tradition says the young princes still appear in the Bloody Tower, hand in hand. They are seen as children, standing quietly, or moving through the room as if still unsure where they are supposed to go. But it isn't just the sightings. On the channel, we often talk about residual hauntings, the idea that stone carries memory. Some people speak of hearing children's footsteps or faint laughter in parts of the tower where no children should be. Others describe an uncomfortable stillness, a sudden drop in temperature, as if the room has withdrawn into itself to protect its secrets. The princes are remembered not only as royal children, but as figures lost between record and rumour. The haunting is not about spectacle, it is about absence. It is about 2 children held behind walls, cut off from the world, waiting while adults argue over power and the crown. A solved crime becomes history. An unsolved one stays open in the mind, and the tower gives that open wound a physical place to live. Edward and Richard remain inside, not as kings, but as 2 lost children, still standing in the shadows of a story that never found its ending. Some executions at the Tower of London were remembered because of the person who died. Margaret Pole's was remembered because of the horror in the way it was carried out. She was the Countess of Salisbury, a woman with royal blood and one of the last surviving members of the Plantagenet line. By the time Henry VIII turned against her family, Margaret was already in her 60s. She had once served close to the royal household, but her name, her relatives, and her connection to the old dynasty made her dangerous in a court where loyalty could change overnight. Margaret was arrested in November 1538 and brought to the Tower. She was never given the kind of public trial that might have allowed her to answer the accusations properly. Instead, she remained imprisoned for more than 2 years, while the Crown dealt with the wider threat it believed her family represented. On the 27th of May 1541, she was taken to Tower Green for execution. Margaret was now around 67 years old, and even by the standards of the Tudor court, what followed was remembered as a disgrace. The executioner was inexperienced, the arrangements were poor, and the killing did not end with one clean strike. When she saw the chopping block, she refused to put her head down on it. She said that only real traitors did that, and she wasn't a traitor at all. What happened next was absolutely horrible. The guy with the axe wasn't very good at his job, so he ended up chasing her all around the wooden platform, swinging his axe at her over and over. It took 11 hits before she finally died. What a terrifying end the poor woman had. On or around the anniversary of her execution, people have reported hearing screams across Tower Green. The sound is said to rise suddenly from the area where Margaret was killed, carrying across the open ground as though the final moments of the execution are being repeated. Some witnesses have spoken of more than a voice. They have described movement on the green, a shadowy figure struggling near the place where the scaffold once stood, followed by another shape closing in behind her. The scene lasts only briefly before the ground appears empty again. Just think for a moment. Is she still reliving that final chase before her death? The green has seen many executions, yet most are now reduced to names and dates. Margaret's remained different because the killing itself became part of the story. People did not only remember that she died there, they remembered the failed blows, the panic around the scaffold, and the belief that a woman who had never been properly heard in life was still making herself heard afterwards. Lady Jane Grey was still a teenager when powerful people placed her on the English throne. Her reign lasted only 9 days, and when the plan collapsed, the people who had used her could no longer protect her. Jane was brought to the Tower of London, held there as a prisoner, and eventually sentenced to death for a claim to the crown that had never truly been her own. She spent her final months inside the fortress, waiting to learn whether she would be spared. For a time, there was reason to believe she might survive, but that hope gradually disappeared. On the 12th of February, 1554, Jane was taken to a scaffold on Tower Green. She was about 16 or 17 years old. Blindfolded beside the block, she reached forward but could not find it. She asked where it was until someone nearby guided her hands into place. Soon afterwards, the axe fell. That moment has followed Jane's story ever since. She had been directed towards the throne by other people, and at the end of her life, she was once again waiting for someone to tell her where she was supposed to go. The ghost associated with Jane is seen as a pale young woman standing alone, often near the walls and battlements connected with her imprisonment. The most famous sighting happened on the 12th of February 1957, exactly 403 years after Jane's execution. 2 guards on duty noticed a white shape forming on the battlements. As they watched, the shape took on the appearance of a young woman dressed in pale clothing. Both men had seen it, and the date made the identity almost impossible for them to ignore. It was the anniversary of Jane's death, and the figure had appeared close to the place where she had spent her final months as a prisoner. Another encounter had been reported years earlier by a woman named Nellie, who lived within the Tower community during the 1920s. One evening, Nellie and several friends noticed the face of a young girl looking out from a window in a building connected with the site of Jane's former prison quarters. Nobody in the group recognized her, and when the room was searched, it was empty. Of the 2 encounters, the face at the window may be the more unsettling. A white figure on the battlements can become part of a grand royal legend, but a teenage girl watching through a window feels much closer to the reality of Jane's final months. She had been confined within the tower while the world outside continued without her, waiting for news that would decide whether she lived or died. The Tower of London is a place where certain sounds seem to belong. Boots on stone, keys turning in heavy locks, and voices carrying between the walls all fit naturally within a fortress that has been guarded for centuries. The sound of sandals is different. Around the medieval palace and the South Wall Walk, people have spoken of hearing slow footsteps passing through areas that appear to be empty. They are not described as the firm tread of a soldier or the hurried movement of a visitor. The sound is softer, with the flat slap of sandals against the stone, moving at the steady pace of someone walking through a religious house rather than a royal fortress. The footsteps are often heard before anything is seen. They approach along a passage or behind a witness, close enough to make someone turn and expect another person to come into view. Yet the walkway remains empty, and the sound continues for several more steps before fading. On some occasions, a dark-robed figure has been noticed near the palace buildings. He is usually described only briefly as a monk or religious man in a long habit, moving through an archway or along the wall before disappearing. There is rarely time to see a face, and no single prisoner or resident has ever been firmly identified as the source of the haunting. The story is usually connected with the tower's medieval religious history and, more distantly, with the uneasy tradition surrounding Thomas Becket. Long before the tower became known mainly as a prison, it was also a royal residence with chapels, priests, and religious ceremonies forming part of daily life. The medieval palace stood close to those older spaces, and the sound of a monk moving through the area would once have been entirely ordinary. One old tradition claimed that a ghostly figure dressed as a priest appeared near the new walls and struck them with his cross, causing part of the work to collapse. Whether that tale was created to explain genuine problems with the construction or grew from the fear surrounding Becket's murder, it gave the tower one of its earliest religious hauntings. The monk heard around the medieval palace is sometimes drawn into that older story. Although the figure has never offered a name and the witnesses rarely see enough to identify him, what remains consistent is the sound. Sandals on stone, moving through a fortress where no monk should still be walking. The figure is sometimes called the Tower Monk, but even that name tells us very little. He may be connected with one of the chapels, with the clergy who once served the royal household, or with an older legend that became attached to the same part of the fortress. He could also represent several stories gradually joined together over time. A monk walking through the medieval palace would once have drawn no attention at all. Today, the same sound is enough to make people stop, turn around, and listen as the footsteps continue through an empty fortress. Some hauntings begin with something seen at a distance. The reports from the White Tower Armoury are different. People do not always describe a figure or a voice. They describe the sudden feeling that the room has closed around them, and that something unseen has begun to tighten across the chest and throat. The White Tower is the oldest part of the fortress, built in the years after the Norman conquest. Its walls are thick, its rooms are enclosed, and the armour displayed inside gives the building a very different atmosphere from the open spaces elsewhere in the tower. Rows of weapons, mounted figures, and suits of plate armour fill galleries that were once designed to display royal strength. Among the most famous objects is the armour associated with Henry VIII, including the large tournament suits made during his reign. These pieces were created to protect the body and impress anyone who saw them. Yet the strange experiences reported in the gallery do not concern the armour moving or a figure stepping out from behind it. The sensation seems to come from the room itself. Visitors and guards have described entering the armoury and suddenly finding it difficult to breathe. The feeling can begin as pressure across the shoulders, almost as though a heavy cloak has been placed over the upper body. Within moments, that pressure appears to tighten around the neck. There may be no warning before it starts. One person can feel perfectly normal, while someone standing only a short distance away begins to panic. The throat tightens, the chest becomes heavy, and the instinct is to get out of the room as quickly as possible. Once outside the gallery, the sensation often disappears. That sudden relief is one reason the experiences have been remembered. A person may blame the enclosed space, the thickness of the walls, or the sight of so many weapons until they leave the room and realize that their breathing has returned almost immediately. One guard is said to have experienced something far more violent while patrolling the gallery during a stormy night. As he moved through the room, he felt what seemed like hands closing around his throat from behind. He turned, expecting to find another person standing there, but the gallery was empty. The pressure did not stop. It tightened hard enough to leave him struggling for breath, and for several moments he believed he was being physically choked. He fought against something he could not see until the grip finally released him. When the guard reached safety, red marks were reportedly visible around his neck. That detail turns the story from a passing feeling into something much more disturbing. A heavy atmosphere can be explained away. Panic in a dark room can make the body react in frightening ways. Marks left on the skin are harder to dismiss, especially when the person involved believed that unseen hands had caused them. The presence of the armour may add to the effect without being the cause of it. A suit of plate armour is shaped like a human body but contains nobody inside. When several stand together in a quiet room, they can create the uncomfortable impression of being watched, even though every visor remains closed and every figure is empty. The heavier suits also have a physical presence that photographs rarely capture. They fill the space above the visitor, reflecting light across steel surfaces, while weapons point from the walls nearby. In such a room, the mind does not need much encouragement to become uneasy. Whatever causes it, the experience is brief and intensely physical. There is often nothing to see before it begins, and nothing left behind once it ends, apart from a racing heartbeat and the need to breathe deeply after reaching the next room. The White Tower was built to make people feel the power of the crown. Nearly 1,000 years later, the armoury can still make visitors feel small and trapped within its walls. For some, the room does more than create discomfort. It seems to place invisible pressure around the throat and wait to see how long they can remain inside. Guy Fawkes is one of the most recognisable prisoners ever held at the Tower of London. After the failure of the gunpowder plot in November 1605, he was brought to the fortress for interrogation and torture. His signature, barely formed on a later confession, shows how badly his treatment affected him. It would be easy to turn that history into a simple story about screams still being heard inside the tower, but one reported encounter is much stranger than that. It began with a watchman hearing a faint buzzing sound. He was inside a room where a gas heater normally provided warmth. Nothing appeared unusual at first, but the buzzing continued, close enough to draw his attention towards the heater. When he looked across the room, the familiar appliance was no longer there. In its place stood a large, open fire. Logs burned in a grate that did not belong in the room, as the watchman knew it. The fire gave off enough light to change the appearance of the walls, replacing the familiar room with something older. It did not look as though an object had simply been placed in front of the heater. For a few moments, the modern fittings seemed to have disappeared altogether. Two men were standing beside the flames. Both wore clothing from another period, with breeches, stockings, and heavy garments that belonged to centuries before the watchman's own time. They had beards, and they appeared comfortable in the room, as though the fire and everything around it were exactly as they expected them to be. The watchman remained where he was, trying to understand what he was seeing. The scene looked complete. It was not a pale figure crossing the edge of his vision, or a reflection caught in old glass. There was a working fire, two men beside it, and an earlier version of the room occupying the space where the modern one should have been. Then one of the men turned and looked directly at him. The eye contact lasted only briefly. The fire, the two men, and the altered room disappeared, leaving the watchman facing the ordinary heater once again. The men were never firmly identified, although the encounter has often been placed alongside the darker traditions connected with Guy Fawkes and the prisoners of the gunpowder plot. Fawkes was interrogated inside the tower after refusing to reveal the names of his fellow conspirators. Permission was given for torture to be used, beginning with less severe methods before moving to the rack if he continued to resist. The tower has been altered many times, with fireplaces removed, rooms repurposed, and modern heating introduced into spaces that once depended on open flames. Most of those earlier interiors survive only in plans, written descriptions, and traces within the stone. Yet the watchman's experience suggested that one of them had not disappeared completely. The room did not produce a ghost in the usual sense. It produced an earlier version of itself, complete with occupants who seemed unaware of anything strange until one of them noticed the man standing beyond the firelight. Then the past closed again, leaving the watchman alone with the quiet heater and no sign that the room had changed at all. By the early 19th century, the Martin Tower was being used as the jewel house, with the crown jewels kept behind its guarded doors. It was one of the most secure parts of the fortress, watched by sentries and overseen by the keeper of the jewels. Yet in January 1816, this carefully protected building became the setting for two encounters that remain among the strangest ever reported at the Tower of London. The first involved Edmund Lenthal Swifter, who had recently taken up his position as keeper of the crown jewels and was living inside the Martin Tower with his family. One evening, they were gathered in one of the rooms when something appeared near the ceiling. Swift described it as a glass-like cylinder or tube filled with a pale blue and white substance that seemed to move and roll inside it. It was not a human figure, and it did not resemble any of the familiar ghosts associated with the tower. It simply hovered above the family, glowing faintly as the strange material continued turning within it. At first, the object remained close to the ceiling, giving everyone in the room enough time to see that something unusual was there. Then it began to move towards Swifter's wife. As it came closer, she cried out and said that it had seized her, although there appeared to be nothing solid connecting the shape with her body. Swift reacted by grabbing a chair and throwing it towards the object, but the chair passed through the glowing form and struck the wall beyond it. The cylinder disappeared immediately afterwards. Only a few days later, the Martin Tower produced an encounter that was somehow even more alarming. A sentry was standing guard outside the jewel house when he noticed a large dark shape emerging from beneath or close to the doorway. As it came into view, it took on the form of a bear. The animal appeared full-sized and solid enough to make the guard believe that a dangerous creature had escaped somewhere inside the tower. That possibility was not as absurd as it might sound today. The tower had once housed the royal menagerie, where lions, bears, and other animals were kept for centuries. Although the famous menagerie was associated with other parts of the fortress, the sight of a large animal inside the grounds still belonged within living memory and tower tradition. The sentry had no time to consider where the bear might have come from. It moved towards him, and he responded as a soldier had been trained to do. He lowered his weapon and drove the bayonet directly at the animal. The blade passed through it. Instead of striking flesh, the bayonet continued forward and became lodged in the wooden door behind the apparition. The bear vanished, and the sentry collapsed in terror. Swifter was among those who later found the guard in a deeply distressed condition. The man remained convinced that he had seen a real bear advancing towards him, only to discover at the moment of impact that nothing solid had been there. The shock stayed with him, and the long-repeated story says that he died only a few days later. Perhaps the two incidents were unrelated, brought together only because they happened in the same building within a short period. Yet the Martin Tower had been quiet enough before the Swifter family arrived, and suddenly it seemed capable of producing forms that did not fit the usual pattern of a haunting. Arbella Stuart is said to haunt the Queen's house, where a female figure has been seen moving quietly through the old rooms and passages. She is usually recognized less by any dramatic appearance than by the sadness attached to the place, because Arbella came to the tower after coming painfully close to escaping the royal control that had followed her for most of her life. Her bloodline placed her close enough to the throne to make the crown wary of every major decision she made. When she secretly married William Seymour, the marriage was treated as a political threat, and the couple was separated and placed under guard. Arbella refused to accept that separation. In 1611, she disguised herself, slipped away from those watching her, and travelled towards the coast, hoping to meet Seymour and escape abroad. She reached a ship and came within sight of freedom, but the authorities caught up with her before she could leave English waters. Seymour escaped. Arbella was brought back alone. She was taken to the Tower of London and confined there while her health steadily declined. The failed escape had taken away more than her freedom. It had also left her separated from the man she had risked everything to marry, with little hope that they would be reunited. During her imprisonment, Arbella became increasingly unwell and stopped eating properly. Whether this began as a deliberate refusal of food or grew from her failing physical and mental health is unclear, but she continued to weaken until she died inside the tower in September 1615. Her ghost is most often linked with the Queen's house, where a woman in period clothing is said to pass through rooms or along the corridors before fading from sight. The figure is usually glimpsed briefly, sometimes at a distance, as though she is moving through a part of the house that belongs to another time. People who connect the apparition with Arbella often return to the same detail. She died after being brought back from an escape that had almost succeeded. She had reached the water, boarded a vessel, and believed she was finally beyond the reach of the court. Within a short time, she was again behind guarded walls, while Seymour remained free somewhere outside them. The figure reported in the house is often described as quiet and withdrawn, moving through the building rather than approaching the people who see her. She appears close to the place where Arbella's strength failed and where the freedom she had briefly touched was taken from her again. Then she was returned to the tower, and the Queen's house became the last place she knew. Henry VI had been king since infancy, but he was far better suited to religion and study than the violent struggle surrounding the English crown. He was known for his strong faith, his support for education, and his preference for peace. His reign, however, was shaped by political division, military defeat, and the conflict later known as the Wars of the Roses. By 1471, Henry had lost the throne and was being held inside the Tower of London. His son had been killed, the Lancastrian cause had collapsed, and Edward IV had returned to power. On the night of the 21st of May, 1471, Henry died inside the Wakefield Tower. Henry's death was officially blamed on grief, but suspicion of murder spread almost immediately. No surviving account proves who was responsible or exactly what happened inside the tower that night. Later tradition placed Henry at prayer in the Wakefield Tower when he was attacked, and it is that version of his final moments that became closely tied to the haunting. His body was carried through London and displayed at St. Paul's so that the public could see he was dead. People later claimed that blood had appeared on his face during the journey, which some took as a sign that his death had been violent. He was eventually buried at Chertsey Abbey before Richard III later had his remains moved to St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The Wakefield Tower remained the place most closely connected with his final night, and over time, stories began to circulate that Henry still returned there. The reported apparition usually appears late on the 21st of May. A pale man in robes is seen moving through the room at a slow and steady pace. His attention appears fixed on the area once associated with the altar, as though the surrounding tower has fallen away and he is once again alone in the private world of prayer. Some witnesses describe him kneeling, while others see him standing with his head lowered. He remains within that small part of the room, repeating the movements of a man absorbed in worship. The atmosphere around the figure is described as deeply still, with the former king appearing unaware of anyone watching him. As midnight approaches, the figure begins to fade. The outline becomes less distinct until the stone wall can be seen through it, and then the room is empty once more. The Tower of London has always been a place where history and memory sit very close together. Some of its ghosts are famous because their names were recorded, their deaths were witnessed, and their stories were passed down through generations. Others remain only as footsteps, a face at a window, a hand on the shoulder, or a sudden fear in an empty passage. Perhaps that is why the tower continues to feel different from other historic buildings. Its hauntings are not confined to one century or one kind of death. They belong to kings, prisoners, soldiers, young people used by powerful families, and figures whose names have been lost completely. Part 1 looked at the forgotten workers and prisoners said to remain within these walls. Part 2 has followed the better-known dead, along with the stranger presences that history has never been able to identify. Whether these encounters are ghosts, memories, or stories shaped by centuries of fear, they continue to return people to the same rooms, chapels, and stretches of stone. The tower has survived fires, rebuilding, and almost 1,000 years of change, yet the oldest stories still seem attached to the places where they began. Maybe that is the real reason its ghosts endure. The tower does not allow history to feel safely finished. It keeps the past close enough to be heard, seen, and sometimes felt by the people walking through it today.